The bus dropped me off on a narrow gravel road that looked like it hadn't seen much traffic in years. When the engine faded into the distance and the dust finally settled, I realized something uncomfortable. I was completely alone. The mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, tall and quiet like they had been standing there long before people like me ever existed. Pine trees covered the slopes, and the air smelled sharp and cold, nothing like the city I had just left behind. I tightened my grip on the worn duffel bag hanging from my shoulder. Everything I owned was stuffed inside it. 2 shirts, a pair of boots that had seen better days, and about $12 in loose change rattling in the side pocket. Not exactly the kind of luggage that promised a fresh start. But a fresh start was exactly what I needed. A wooden sign stood beside the dirt road, crooked and half covered with moss. Silver Ridge Wildlife Reserve, staff entrance. I stared at it for a long moment. This place wasn't on any tourist map. It was miles away from the nearest town, hidden deep in the mountains where the roads narrowed and cell signals disappeared. Most people would probably call it isolation. For me, it felt like the only place left to run. The gravel crunched under my boots as I started walking up the long path toward the reserve buildings. The silence out here was different from the city. In the city, silence meant something was wrong. But here, silence felt alive. The wind moved through the trees like a whisper, and somewhere far off, a hawk cried across the sky. Still, the quiet made my chest tight. Because when everything is silent, it becomes a lot harder to ignore your own thoughts. I had left the city before things could fall completely apart. Before the mistakes caught up to me. Before the people I cared about had to watch me fail again. Running away wasn't brave. But staying had started to feel impossible. After a 15-minute walk, the trees finally opened into a wide clearing. A few wooden buildings stood scattered across the land. A main cabin, a tool shed, and several long barns that looked like they had survived more storms than I could count. Horses moved slowly inside a fenced pasture nearby, their dark shapes calm against the green hills. Everything about the place looked simple, but something about it also felt serious. Like this land expected something from the people who stepped onto it. I walked up the wooden steps of the main cabin and knocked on the door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door creaked open. The man standing there didn't say a word. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with weathered skin that looked like it had spent years under sun and wind. A few streaks of gray ran through his dark beard, and his eyes studied me with the kind of quiet focus that made it feel like he could see straight through the lies people usually told. For about 10 seconds, he just looked at me. Then his gaze dropped to my duffel bag, my worn boots, my tired face. "You lost?" he asked. His voice was calm, but there was something sharp behind it. I shook my head. "No, sir. I came about the job." Another pause. "You ever worked with wildlife before?" "No." "Ever worked on a reserve?" "No, sir." "Ever done anything that didn't end with you quitting halfway through?" That question caught me off guard. I hesitated. "Not lately," I admitted. Something flickered in his eyes, though his expression stayed neutral. Finally, he stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Name's Daniel Hayes," he said. "Head ranger here." I stepped inside the cabin. The room smelled faintly of wood smoke and leather. Maps of the surrounding mountains were pinned across the walls, along with photographs of animals and weather charts. Daniel closed the door behind me. Then he pointed toward a wooden board hanging beside the entrance. For lines were painted across it in thick black letters. Rules. Do your job. Respect the land. No excuses. No attachments. I frowned slightly, reading the last one again. Daniel followed my gaze. "You break those rules," he said quietly, "and you're gone." I nodded slowly. "That clue?" "Yes, sir." He studied me for another long moment, like he was deciding whether I belonged here or not. Then he walked toward the door again and opened it, gesturing toward the endless mountains outside. His voice was steady. "Good." He stepped onto the porch and looked out across the wilderness. Then he said something that settled deep in my chest. "Because out here." He glanced back at me. "Nature doesn't forgive mistakes." The first thing Daniel did the next morning was wake me before sunrise. Not with shouting. Not with banging on the door. Just a single knock on the bunkhouse wall and a calm voice from outside. 5 minutes. That was it. I pulled myself out of the narrow bed, still sore from the long bus ride and the cold mountain air that crept through the wooden walls during the night. When I stepped outside, the sky was still dark blue, the kind of quiet moment that exists just before the sun begins to rise. Daniel was already standing near the main barn, coffee in one hand, clipboard in the other. He looked like he had been awake for hours. "You move slow," he said without looking at me. "Still adjusting," I replied. He handed me a pair of worn leather gloves. "You'll adjust faster if you keep moving." We walked toward the main barn together. Horses shifted softly inside the stalls, their hooves scraping gently against the wooden floors. The air smelled like hay, leather, and cool morning air. Daniel stopped near the entrance and pointed to the same wooden rule board I had seen the night before. The letters were old but still clear. Reserve rules. 1. Respect the land. 2. Respect the animals. 3. No excuses. 4. No emotional attachments. I had read them once already, but something about seeing them again in the daylight made the last one stand out even more. No emotional attachments. It felt strange. I looked at Daniel. "You mind explaining that one?" I asked, nodding toward the board. He followed my gaze but didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow sip of coffee. "Rule 1, he said calmly, tapping the board. "Respect the land." He pointed toward the mountains beyond the fence. "Everything out here depends on balance. The soil, the trees, the water, the animals. If you damage one part of it, the whole system feels it." I nodded slowly. "Rule 2, he continued. "Respect the animals." A horse in the nearby stall snorted softly. Daniel walked over and rested a hand gently against the wooden gate. "Animals don't think like people," he said. "They react to survival. Fear, trust, territory. If you ignore that, you get hurt. Or worse, you get them hurt." He looked back at me. "You ever been around horses before?" "Not really." "Then here's your first lesson." He opened the stall gate slightly but kept one hand steady on the frame. "Never walk straight at a horse from behind," he explained. "That's their blind spot. If they get startled, they kick first and think later." I stepped closer, watching the animal carefully. "Always approach from the side," he said, demonstrating with a slow movement. "Let them see you. Let them smell you. Animals trust information more than confidence." The horse lowered its head slightly as Daniel gently touched its neck. "See that?" he said. "Relaxed ears. Slow breathing. That means it's comfortable." Then he stepped away and motioned for me to try. I approached carefully, remembering what he said. The horse watched me but didn't pull away. "Good," Daniel said quietly. Then he returned to the rule board. "Rule 3. No excuses." That one needed no explanation. "You make a mistake out here," he said. "You own it. No blaming weather. No blaming equipment. No blaming someone else." His voice stayed calm, but there was a firmness behind it that made the rule feel heavier. Then I pointed again to the last line. "Okay," I said. "But what about that one?" Daniel's expression changed just slightly. Not anger. More like distance. "Rule 4, he said. "No emotional attachments." I waited. He didn't continue. "So, we're not supposed to care about the animals?" I asked. "That's not what it means." "Then what does it mean?" Daniel looked past me toward the wide pasture, where the morning light was finally beginning to spread across the hills. For a moment, he looked like he was somewhere else entirely. "Out here," he said slowly, "nature has its own rules." A hawk circled high above the valley. Animals get injured. Some don't survive. Sometimes you have to make hard decisions. His voice stayed steady. If you get too attached, you stop thinking clearly. I frowned slightly. That sounds a little cold. Daniel finally looked directly at me again. "It's not cold," he said. "It's survival." Then he turned toward the barn doors and tossed me a pitchfork. "Now," he added, walking toward the stalls, "let's see if you can clean a stable without getting kicked." As I followed him into the barn, I glanced back once more at the rule board. 3 of the rules made perfect sense. But the 4th one stayed stuck in my head. No emotional attachments. I had a feeling that rule had a story behind it. And somehow, I suspected Daniel Hayes was the reason it existed. By the 3rd day at Silver Ridge, I had learned one simple truth. Working at a wildlife reserve looked a lot easier than it actually was. Daniel believed in learning through work, not long explanations. So instead of handing me a manual or giving a speech, he simply started assigning tasks. "Feed the horses first," he said early one morning, handing me a large metal bucket filled with grain. "Then clean the stalls. After that, you'll ride the south trail and check the perimeter fence." That sounded simple enough. At least, it did at the time. The feeding part went fine in the beginning. The horses gathered near the fence when they heard the sound of the bucket, their ears flicking forward with interest. Daniel had shown me how to move calmly and keep my movements slow. But calm was harder than it sounded. One of the larger horses, a dark brown stallion named Ranger, watched me closely as I stepped into the paddock. His size alone was intimidating, easily twice my weight with muscles that looked like they could pull down a tree. I tried to act confident. Unfortunately, horses are very good at noticing when confidence is fake. As I stepped closer with the bucket, Ranger suddenly snorted and tossed his head. The movement startled me, and without thinking I jerked backward. The grain bucket tipped sideways. Half the food spilled straight into the dirt. Behind me, someone laughed. I turned to see another ranch hand leaning against the fence rail. He was tall and lean with a dusty cowboy hat pulled low over his eyes. His name was Logan Reed, and from the look on his face, he had already decided I was the entertainment for the week. "Well," Logan said, clapping slowly, "that might be the fastest feeding job I've ever seen." I tried to ignore him and scoop up what grain I could, but the horses had already lost interest and wandered off. Logan smirked. "City boy, hey?" I didn't answer. "Let me guess," he continued. "You thought working out here meant riding horses and enjoying the scenery." He stepped closer to the fence. "Turns out it's mostly sweat and embarrassment." I clenched my jaw and went back to cleaning the stalls. Unfortunately, that didn't go much better. Cleaning a stable might sound like simple work, but after 2 hours of shoveling hay, hauling manure, and trying to keep dust out of my lungs, my arms felt like they were made of stone. At one point I accidentally left a stall gate unlatched. The same horse I had tried feeding earlier pushed the gate open and wandered halfway across the yard before I noticed. Logan was the one who pointed it out. "Hey, rookie," he called loudly from across the fence. "You planning to let the whole herd escape, or just that one?" By the time I managed to guide the horse back, I was exhausted, dirty, and more than a little frustrated. And the day wasn't even halfway over. Daniel said very little through all of it. He moved around the reserve quietly, checking fences, adjusting equipment, and occasionally watching from a distance while I worked. He didn't step in when I struggled. He didn't correct Logan's comments. He simply observed. Later that afternoon came the final task of the day. Trail patrol. Daniel handed me the reins of a calm gray horse named Willow. "South Trail," he said. "Follow the ridge line. Check the fences and watch for loose branches." I climbed into the saddle, trying to remember everything he had shown me. The horse shifted beneath me. My grip tightened on the reins. Immediately Willow's ears flicked backward. Daniel noticed. "You're holding too tight," he said calmly. "I'm just trying to stay balanced." "That's not balance." He stepped closer to the horse and gently lowered my hands. "Animals don't read your words," he explained. "They read your body." The horse shifted again. Daniel nodded toward the reins. "Right now," he continued, "that horse thinks you're nervous." I swallowed. "Maybe I am. That's the problem." He looked directly at me. "Horses sense fear faster than people do. Then he added something that stayed with me long after that moment. And they sense ego even faster. I frowned slightly. Ego? Daniel crossed his arms. Some people try to control animals by force, he said. They pull harder, shout louder, push forward without listening. Willow shifted again beneath me. But animals don't respond to ego, he continued. They respond to calm leadership. The horse slowly relaxed when I loosened my grip. Daniel nodded once. Lesson number 1, he said quietly. Out here, if you bring fear or ego into the work. He glanced at the horse, then back at me. The animals will always win. The first week at Silver Ridge was humbling. Every task that looked simple from a distance turned out to require patience, awareness, and more physical effort than I expected. By the end of each day my hands were sore, my back ached, and my pride had taken more than a few bruises. But Daniel never rushed the process. He believed something important about learning. People understand lessons better when they struggle first. One quiet morning, after watching me wrestle with a stubborn horse for nearly 10 minutes, he finally stepped into the paddock. You're trying too hard, he said calmly. I wiped the sweat from my forehead. Trying too hard to do what? To control him. The horse in front of me, a tall chestnut mare, tossed her head again and stepped sideways. I tightened the reins instinctively. Daniel shook his head. That right there, he said, pointing to my hands, is the problem. He walked closer and gently lowered the reins. Animals don't respond well to pressure without understanding, he explained. Especially horses. The mare's ears flicked forward as Daniel approached her slowly from the side. His movements were relaxed, almost effortless, like he had all the time in the world. He placed a hand softly along her neck. Immediately, the horse calmed. First rule when approaching any animal, he said. Let them see you. He stepped back slightly so I could watch. Most animals rely on body language more than sound. Sudden movement, direct eye contact, or rushing toward them can feel like a threat. I nodded, watching carefully. Approach from the side, Daniel continued. Slow steps, relaxed shoulders. He motioned for me to try again. I took a breath and stepped forward carefully. This time I moved slower, keeping my posture loose instead of stiff. The mare watched me but didn't pull away. Daniel nodded slightly. Better. He pointed to the horse's head. Look at her ears. I noticed they were tilted slightly toward me. That means she's paying attention, Daniel said. If her ears were pinned back, that would mean she feels threatened or irritated. He pointed again. And her breathing. I listened closely. The horse's breathing was steady. Animals communicate constantly, he explained. You just have to learn their language. Over the next few days, Daniel began teaching me more than just chores. Each lesson felt small at first, but together they started forming a bigger picture. He showed me how horses reacted to posture. If you stand tall and relaxed, he said one afternoon, they see you as calm leadership. But if you tense up, they think something is wrong. Another lesson involved breathing. One evening while we were guiding a nervous young horse back into the barn, Daniel stopped me before I reached for the reins. Slow your breathing, he said. I frowned slightly. Why? Horses mirror energy. He demonstrated by placing a gentle hand near the horse's neck. When people panic, animals feel it immediately, he explained. But when you stay calm, they settle faster. I focused on taking slower breaths. Gradually, the horse's movements became less restless. Daniel nodded again. That's trust beginning. Trust? I asked. Yes. He leaned against the fence beside me. People think animals obey commands, he said. But most of the time they're actually responding to trust. He gestured toward the pasture where several horses grazed peacefully. A horse weighing half a ton could overpower any human in seconds, he added. The reason they don't is because they trust the person guiding them. I watched the animals quietly for a moment. So trust is stronger than force, I said. Daniel looked at me briefly. Exactly. The work slowly became easier as the days passed. I still made mistakes, but fewer than before. My movements were less rushed, my reactions more controlled. And something else started to change too. Daniel still kept his distance most of the time, but there were moments when the silence between us felt less cold. Sometimes he would correct my grip on the reins without saying a word. Other times he would stand beside me at the fence while we watched the horses settle for the evening. He never spoke about personal things. But he didn't need to. Out there, among the quiet hills and open fields, most lessons were learned without many words. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the mountains, Daniel watched me guide the chestnut mare calmly into her stall. This time she followed without resistance. When I closed the gate, Daniel gave a small nod. "That's progress," he said. It wasn't praise exactly, but coming from him, it felt like something close. And for the first time since arriving at Silver Ridge, I realized something important. Learning patience wasn't just about working with animals. It was also about understanding the people who had already mastered it. By the second week at Silver Ridge, I had started getting used to the rhythm of the place. The days were long, the work was demanding, and the mountains never seemed to stop watching. But there was something steady about the routine. Feeding horses at sunrise, checking fences in the afternoon, cleaning the barns before nightfall. Most evenings ended the same way. The ranch hands headed back to the bunkhouse, exhausted and covered in dust. The valley would grow quiet, the sky slowly filling with stars as the wind moved gently through the trees. But one night, something was different. I had stayed behind in the tack room, finishing the last of the equipment cleaning. My hands were sore from scrubbing leather straps, and the lantern on the wall cast long shadows across the wooden floor. When I finally stepped outside, the reserve was almost completely silent. Almost. Because somewhere inside the barn, I heard a voice. Soft, low, calm. At first, I thought it might be another worker still finishing chores. But when I stepped closer to the barn door, I realized it was Daniel. The light from a small lantern glowed inside one of the stalls. Curiosity pulled me forward. I moved quietly toward the open doorway and looked inside. Daniel stood beside one of the horses, the gray mare named Willow. She had been rescued months earlier, Daniel had mentioned once. Injured leg, weak from malnutrition, and too old to survive long in the wild without help. Most of the time she stayed in the barn, resting. But what surprised me wasn't the horse. It was Daniel. He stood beside Willow with one hand resting gently along her neck. His movements were slow and careful, nothing like the firm, commanding ranger I saw during the day. He was talking to her, not giving instructions, not checking her condition, just talking. "You're doing better today," he said quietly. His voice was softer than I had ever heard it before. The horse shifted slightly, leaning into his hand. "That's right," he continued, brushing a few strands of hay from her mane. "You just needed time." I stayed near the doorway, careful not to make any noise. Daniel continued speaking in that calm, steady tone. "You've been through enough already," he said. "No more running." Willow lowered her head slowly, almost like she understood every word. Daniel rubbed the side of her neck gently. "You gave everything you had out there," he murmured. "That's more than most animals ever get the chance to do." For a moment, he just stood there quietly beside her. No orders, no rules, just patience, just kindness. It was strange seeing him like that. During the day, Daniel Hayes was the strict head ranger who spoke in short sentences and expected perfection from everyone around him. But the man standing in that stall looked different. More human, more tired, and somehow more real. After a moment, Willow shifted her weight slightly, favoring her injured leg. Daniel noticed immediately. "Easy," he said softly. "You're safe here." He reached for a brush and slowly ran it along her back. The horse relaxed even more. Watching them together, something finally clicked in my mind. Daniel wasn't cold. He wasn't distant because he didn't care. He was distant because caring too much had probably cost him something before. That thought sat heavy in my chest. Because suddenly the rule board outside the barn made a little more sense. No emotional attachments. Maybe that rule hadn't been written to protect the animals. Maybe it had been written to protect Daniel. After a few more minutes, I stepped back quietly from the doorway, deciding not to interrupt. But just as I turned to leave, Daniel's voice came from behind me. "You planning on standing there all night?" I froze. Slowly, I turned back. Daniel stood in the stall doorway now, arms crossed. He had clearly known I was there the whole time. "I didn't want to interrupt," I said. He studied my face for a moment, then glanced back at Willow. "She's healing," he said simply. I nodded. "You talk to all the horses like that?" I asked. Daniel gave a small shrug. "Animals understand tone better than words." "But you sounded like you meant every word." For a brief moment, something thoughtful passed across his expression. Then he stepped past me and lowered the barn lantern. "Get some sleep," he said. "Early morning tomorrow." As he walked away into the dark yard, I looked once more toward Willow resting quietly in her stall. The image of Daniel standing beside her stayed in my mind. Because that quiet moment had revealed something important. The strict ranger everyone respected was hiding a heart that cared far more than he ever let anyone see. And somehow, that made him even more mysterious than before. Life at Silver Ridge had started to feel almost normal. The work was still hard, but I was learning faster now. Feeding the horses no longer felt like a wrestling match. Cleaning stalls had become routine, and my trail patrols were smoother than they had been during the first week. Daniel still didn't waste words on praise, but I noticed the small changes. He trusted me with more responsibilities. He let me handle some of the younger horses without stepping in. And sometimes, when I finished a task well, he gave a quiet nod that meant more than a long speech ever could. But not everyone at the reserve was happy about it. Logan Reed had been watching, and Logan Reed didn't like change. It started with small comments. At first, it was just the occasional joke thrown across the yard while I worked. "Careful there, Ethan," Logan would say loudly while leaning on the fence. "Don't let the boss catch you doing all his favorite chores." The other workers would laugh awkwardly, unsure whether to join in or ignore it. I tried not to react, but Logan kept going. A few days later, while I was hauling hay toward the barn, he walked beside me with that same crooked grin. "You know," he said casually, "I've worked here 3 years." "That's impressive," I replied flatly. 3 years, he repeated, and Daniel Hayes never once spent this much time teaching anyone. I kept walking. Logan leaned closer. "Funny how that works." I stopped and looked at him. "You got something you want to say?" "Oh, nothing serious," he replied. "Just interesting how the new guy suddenly gets private lessons." His voice grew louder so the others could hear. "Maybe the boss just likes your company." The implication hung in the air. A couple of the workers shifted uncomfortably. I set the hay bale down slowly. "You're imagining things," I said. Logan shrugged. "Maybe." Then he added quietly, "Or maybe you're distracting him." That was enough. I stepped closer, my patience finally running thin. "You've been talking a lot lately," I said, "but you haven't said anything useful." Logan's grin widened. "Careful," he replied. "Wouldn't want to lose that special treatment." Before I could respond, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "That enough, Logan." We both turned. Daniel was standing a few yards away near the barn gate. His arms were relaxed at his sides, but his posture carried a quiet authority that instantly changed the mood. Logan straightened slightly. "Just having a conversation," he said. Daniel took a few slow steps forward. "With him?" he asked, nodding toward me. Logan shrugged again. "Just telling the truth." Daniel stopped beside us. For a moment, he said nothing. His eyes moved from Logan to me, reading the situation without needing an explanation. Then he spoke. "The truth," he said calmly, "is that Ethan's been doing his job." Logan shifted his weight. "And the truth," Daniel continued, "is that you've spent more time talking about it than doing yours." The yard had gone quiet. A few of the other workers nearby had stopped their tasks to listen. Logan forced a laugh. I didn't realize you were keeping score. Daniel's expression didn't change. I'm keeping order. Logan's smile faded slightly. Daniel stepped closer, his voice still calm but firmer now. If you've got a problem with how I run this reserve, he said, you're free to find work somewhere else. The message was clear. Logan held Daniel's gaze for a moment longer, then looked away. Didn't say I had a problem. Good. Daniel nodded once. Then let's get back to work. Logan muttered something under his breath and walked toward the equipment shed. The tension in the yard slowly faded as the other workers returned to their tasks. I picked up the hay bale again. Daniel turned to leave as well. Daniel, I said. He stopped. You didn't have to step in. He looked back at me briefly. Yes, I did. Why? Daniel studied me for a moment. Because rumors spread faster than truth, he said. Then he added quietly, and this place runs on trust. He started walking toward the barn again. But before he disappeared inside, he paused. And Ethan? Yay! Daniel glanced over his shoulder. Don't let other people's noise distract you from learning. Then he went back to work like nothing had happened. But the tension in the air hadn't completely disappeared. Because even though Logan had walked away, the look he gave me before leaving said one thing very clearly. This conflict wasn't over yet. The morning started like any other at Silver Ridge. Cold air hung over the valley, and the early sunlight stretched across the hills in long golden lines. Horses moved slowly through the pasture, their breath visible in the cool mountain air. I was finishing my usual chores near the training paddock when Daniel walked over. We're working with the new stallion today, he said. I glanced toward the far fence where a dark horse paced restlessly inside a smaller enclosure. That one? I asked. Daniel nodded. The stallion had arrived only a few days earlier after being rescued from the mountains. Unlike the calmer horses that had lived on the reserve for years, this one was still wild, strong, nervous, and unpredictable. His name's Storm, Daniel said. Came in from the northern ridge. Storm tossed his head violently, the reins tied to the fence post snapping tight. He doesn't trust people yet, Daniel continued. So we move slow. Logan leaned against the nearby rail watching. Or we let the new guy try, he said with a smirk. Daniel ignored the comment. We'll guide him toward the training gate, Daniel explained. No sudden moves. I nodded. But before we could even start, something went wrong. Storm suddenly reared up, pulling hard against the rope tied to the fence post. The knot held for a second, then snapped loose. The stallion bolted forward. Dust exploded into the air as the horse charged across the paddock, wild energy driving every step. Storm! Daniel shouted. The horse wasn't listening. And worse, he was running straight toward the open yard. On the other side of the fence, a young colt was tied to a training rail. The colt was barely a year old, small, fragile, and completely unaware of the danger racing toward it. If a full-grown stallion hit that rail at full speed, the colt wouldn't stand a chance. Everything happened in seconds. Daniel started running toward Storm, but he was still too far away. Logan jumped back from the fence. The colt panicked, pulling against its rope. And the stallion kept coming. My body moved before my mind had time to think. I ran straight into Storm's path. Ethan! Daniel shouted. But I was already moving. As the stallion thundered past, I grabbed for the loose reins hanging near his neck. For a split second, I thought I had missed. Then my hand caught the leather strap. The force nearly ripped my arm from its socket. Storm dragged me several feet across the dirt before I managed to pull myself closer to his side. Dust filled my mouth and eyes as the horse bucked and twisted, trying to break free. Pain shot through my shoulder, but I held on. Easy! I shouted, trying to remember everything Daniel had taught me. The horse kicked again. My boots scraped against the ground as I fought to stay upright. Calm down. Storm reared once more, then slammed his hooves back into the dirt. For a moment, everything felt out of control. Then something changed. Instead of pulling harder, I loosened my grip slightly. just like Daniel had shown me before. Slow breathing. Steady hands. The stallion snorted loudly, shaking his head. Then, he stopped. Not completely calm, but no longer charging forward. The colt behind the fence was safe. The yard went silent. A few seconds later, Daniel reached us. He grabbed the reins carefully and guided Storm away from the fence, speaking softly until the horse finally settled. Only then did he turn to me. "You all right?" he asked. I tried to answer, but the pain in my shoulder hit all at once. I sat down hard in the dirt. "Yeah," I said through a wince. "Mostly." Daniel crouched beside me, checking my arm carefully. "You could have been crushed," he said. "But I wasn't," I replied. Logan walked over slowly, clearly surprised by what had happened. Daniel ignored him. "You stopped him," he said quietly. I shrugged slightly. Guess I remembered the lesson. Daniel looked at me for a long moment. Not like a boss evaluating a worker. Like someone realizing something important. "Storm trusted you enough to stop," he said. "That's not luck." He helped me stand carefully. "Come on," he added. "Let's get that shoulder checked." As we walked toward the barn, I noticed something unusual. Daniel Hayes, the calm, steady ranger who rarely showed emotion, looked genuinely worried. And for the first time since arriving at Silver Ridge, I realized something had changed between us. I wasn't just the new worker anymore. Somewhere between the lessons, the mistakes, and that dangerous moment in the yard, Daniel had started to trust me. The weather in the mountains could change without warning. One moment the sky would be clear and blue, and the next it would look like the world itself was preparing for a fight. That evening started peacefully enough. The horses were settling into their stalls, and the air carried the cool scent of pine drifting down from the ridges. I had just finished checking the south fence when I noticed the clouds gathering over the mountains. Dark ones. Heavy ones. By the time I returned to the barn, the wind had already begun to rise. Daniel stood near the main gate, looking toward the sky with the same focused expression he used when studying the horses. "Storm coming," he said. "Looks bad." I asked. Daniel nodded once. "Mountain storms usually are." Thunder rolled somewhere far away, deep and low like the mountains themselves were growling. "Get the horses inside," Daniel added. "All of them." Within minutes the quiet ranch turned into organized chaos. The wind grew stronger, whipping dust across the yard while the horses grew restless, sensing the change in the air. Lightning flashed across the distant hills. Logan and the other workers rushed to secure the outer gates before heading back toward the bunkhouse. Daniel and I stayed behind in the main barn. One by one, we guided the last horses into their stalls while the storm finally arrived. Rain hammered against the wooden roof. The wind howled through the valley, rattling every loose board and shaking the barn doors with violent force. A loud crack of thunder followed, close enough to make the ground tremble. Inside the barn, the lantern light flickered while the horses shifted nervously. For the first time all day, there was nothing left to do but wait. Daniel leaned against one of the support beams while I sat on a wooden crate across the aisle. The storm outside roared like a living thing. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel finally broke the silence. "You handled Storm well today." His voice was calm, almost thoughtful. "Honestly," I said, "I didn't really think. I just reacted." Daniel gave a small nod. "Sometimes that's the difference between courage and stupidity." I laughed quietly. "Which one was that?" "That depends," he replied, "on whether you survive it." Lightning flashed again, filling the barn with bright white light for a moment before fading back into darkness. The horses shifted in their stalls. "You ever seen a mountain storm before?" Daniel asked. I shook my head. "Not like this." The wind howled through the gaps in the barn walls. "I've seen storms before," I said slowly. "Just different kinds." Daniel glanced at me. "The kind that follow you?" he asked. I nodded. "Something like that." Another moment of silence passed between us. Then Daniel spoke again, his voice quieter now. "I had someone working here once." That caught my attention. A long time ago, he continued. He was young, didn't know much about wildlife or ranch work, but he learned fast. I listened carefully. He reminded me of someone, Daniel added. Who? Daniel didn't answer right away. Someone who believed he could handle anything. Lightning flashed again. The thunder that followed shook the barn doors violently. One night, Daniel said, we were moving horses during a storm like this. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor as he spoke. One of the animals panicked and broke through the fence. I could already feel where the story was heading. He tried to stop it. Daniel continued quietly. Just like you did today. My chest tightened. The horse kicked, Daniel said. Hard. The storm outside seemed to grow louder. He didn't survive the night. For a long moment, the only sound inside the barn was the rain crashing against the roof. I was the one responsible for training him, Daniel said. I should have stopped him. You couldn't have known, I said. Daniel shook his head slightly. That's the problem with leadership. He looked up at me then. When someone works under you, their safety becomes your responsibility. The weight in his voice was unmistakable. That's why the rule exists, he added. I already knew which rule he meant. No emotional attachments. If you care too much, Daniel continued, every loss becomes personal. And that makes the work harder. The lantern light flickered again as another flash of lightning split the sky. But avoiding attachments doesn't really solve it, I said quietly. Daniel didn't argue. Instead, he looked out toward the barn doors where the storm raged beyond the wood. Leadership, he said slowly, means carrying the things other people can't. His voice softened. Sometimes those things leave scars. The storm continued for hours. But something about the silence that followed Daniel's story felt heavier than the thunder outside. Because now I understood something important. Daniel Hayes wasn't distant because he didn't care. He kept his distance because once, a long time ago, caring had cost someone their life. The storm had passed by morning. The mountains looked calm again, as if the chaos from the night before had never happened. Fresh rainwater clung to the pine branches, and a thin mist floated above the valley. But the quiet felt different. Heavier. I barely slept that night. Daniel's story kept replaying in my mind. The trainee, the accident, the reason behind the rule that everyone on the ranch followed. No emotional attachments. At sunrise, the ranch slowly returned to life. Logan and the others checked the fences damaged by the storm. Horses were led out one by one from the barn into the open pasture. Daniel was already working when I found him near the training corral. He was repairing a section of broken railing, hammer moving steadily against the wood. For a moment, I considered walking away. But something inside me refused to stay quiet. Daniel. He stopped hammering and looked up. Yes. We need to talk. Daniel studied my face for a second before placing the hammer down on the fence. About what? About your rule. The wind moved gently across the open field. Daniel crossed his arms. There's nothing to discuss. I think there is. His expression hardened slightly. That rule exists for a reason. I know the reason, I said. Daniel's eyes narrowed. You told me last night. For a moment, something unreadable passed across his face. Then he looked away toward the hills. That story wasn't meant to change anything. But it should. Daniel turned back to face me. Careful, Ethan. His voice was calm, but there was warning behind it. You're new here. You don't understand what this work demands. Maybe not, I said, but I understand something else. Daniel waited. You spend every day teaching animals to trust humans. The words came out stronger than I expected. You train horses to believe they're safe around us. Daniel's expression didn't change. But you refuse to trust people yourself. Silence fell between us. Logan and the other workers were too far away to hear. For the first time since I arrived at the ranch, Daniel didn't immediately respond. You think that's the same thing? He asked quietly. I think it's worse. Daniel's jaw tightened. You don't know what you're talking about. Maybe I do. The wind moved through the grass again. You said leadership means carrying things other people can't, I continued. But shutting everyone out isn't leadership. Daniel stared at me. It's fear. The word hung in the air between us. For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. Then he turned and walked a few steps toward the corral fence. His back faced me as he looked out over the ranch. I watched someone die, he said finally. I know. And you think a conversation fixes that? No, I replied. But pretending people don't matter doesn't fix it either. Daniel slowly ran a hand through his hair. The tension in his shoulders was obvious. When you lead people, he said quietly, every mistake becomes yours. That's true, I said. But every success becomes yours too. Daniel turned slightly, looking back at me. And you don't get those successes if you push everyone away. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel exhaled slowly. Almost like a weight he had been carrying for years had finally shifted. You're stubborn, he said. I smiled faintly. I learned from the best. For the first time that morning, Daniel gave a small, tired laugh. He looked around the ranch, the horses, the workers, the mountains beyond the fences. Then he said something I never expected to hear. Maybe I was wrong. The words sounded unfamiliar coming from him. Daniel walked toward the wooden board near the corral gate. It held the ranch rules written in thick black marker. There were only a few. Safety rules, animal handling rules, and one rule written clearly at the bottom. No emotional attachments. Daniel stared at it for a moment. Then he grabbed a cloth from his pocket. Slowly, deliberately, he wiped the words away. The ink smeared across the board until the sentence disappeared completely. Logan noticed from across the yard. So, what does that mean? He called out. Daniel looked back toward the workers. Then he glanced at me. It means, he said calmly, the rule doesn't apply anymore. The ranch fell quiet for a moment. Logan raised his eyebrows. You serious? Daniel nodded. From now on, he added, we work as a team. He paused before finishing. And teams trust each other. The wind moved across the valley again, carrying the fresh scent of rain. For the first time since I arrived at the ranch, something about the place felt different. Not just stronger, but human. Morning arrived slowly over the mountains. Soft sunlight crept across the valley, turning the wet grass into a field of tiny shining diamonds. The air was fresh after the storm, cool and clean, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The ranch was already awake. Horses moved calmly in the pasture, their breath visible in the cool morning air. Workers prepared the day's tasks, checking saddles and tightening straps. But something about the ranch felt different now. Lighter, stronger. Daniel waited near the main gate with 2 horses ready. One for him, one for me. You ready? He asked. I nodded as I adjusted the saddle. Where are we going? Daniel mounted his horse smoothly. Morning ride, he said. The mountains looked different after a storm. We rode out through the open gate and followed the narrow trail that climbed toward the hills. The valley slowly stretched beneath us as we climbed higher. From the ridge, the ranch looked small, a cluster of buildings surrounded by endless green land and distant forests. For a while, we rode in comfortable silence. The kind of silence that didn't feel awkward, just peaceful. After a few minutes, Daniel finally spoke. Logan told me something yesterday. I glanced over. What? He said the new trainees arrive next week. I nodded. Yeah, I heard. Daniel slowed his horse slightly. I want you to train them. I blinked in surprise. Me? You handled Storm. You handled the ranch. And, he paused, you handled me. I laughed softly. That last one was the hardest. Daniel smiled faintly. Leadership isn't about being perfect, he said. It's about learning. We reached the top of the ridge. From there, the entire valley spread out before us. The ranch, the winding river, and the distant mountains glowing in the morning light. It was quiet. peaceful, like the world had reset itself. When we returned to the ranch later that morning, Logan and the others were already working near the corral. The rule board still stood near the gate. But now it looked different. The old sentence was gone. Where it once said, "No emotional attachments," there was now a new message written clearly across the wood. Crossmark no attachments. Heavy checkmark loyalty and respect. Logan noticed us looking. "Daniel changed it this morning," he said with a grin. Daniel simply shrugged. "Seemed like a better rule." A young worker nearby asked curiously, "So what's the difference?" Daniel looked toward the horses grazing peacefully across the pasture. Then he answered quietly, "Attachments can break you." He paused before finishing. "But loyalty makes you stronger." The ranch continued moving around us. Horses training, workers laughing, new tasks beginning, life moving forward. And for the first time since I arrived, I realized something important. This place wasn't just a ranch anymore. It was a team, a family. Daniel walked toward the barn while I stayed near the corral, watching the open road leading toward the valley. Soon new trainees would arrive. People who knew nothing about the ranch. People who would make mistakes. People who needed someone to guide them. Just like I once did. Logan walked past me and smiled. "Guess that makes you the mentor now." I looked out toward the mountains one last time. The storm had passed. The sky was clear again. And for the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel uncertain. It felt open, full of possibilities. Because sometimes the hardest thing to learn in life is not how to lead, or how to survive, but how to trust again.